Welcome to season 2 of Let's Talk About Health in Africa with me, Lenias Hwenda. After a short break, we are back with the Titans of Industry podcast series, where we are bringing you the movers and shakers who are transforming Africa's vaccine manufacturing sector to share with us some of the work that they are doing. Today, I am in conversation with Professor Shabir Madhi, a professor of vaccinology and the dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences in the University of Wits in Johannesburg in South Africa. Professor Madhi worked on 2 of the vaccines that received emergency use authorization in Europe and the US, Novavax and the Oxford vaccine. He is part of the Rubic Consortium, which has been licensed to use the C1 expression system developed by Dyadic to make a COVID vaccine for the African market. Professor Madhi, welcome to the HSS podcast. Let's talk about health in Africa.
Good day. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with your recent project that you have started with the Rubic Consortium. So Africa is the least vaccinated continent because it has had great difficulty in accessing vaccines despite having funds to buy what it needs. And as a result, African governments have come to realize the danger of being overly dependent on others for vaccines that it needs to protect the health security of Africans. So the Africa CDC wants to increase local production of vaccines from the current level of 1% of vaccines consumed in Africa being made on the continent to 40% being made on the continent by 2040. Many companies are stepping forward and making effort to work with partners to make this happen. You yourself and your colleagues have joined efforts to produce a COVID vaccine for Africa with the Rubic Consortium. This is an important project, obviously, so let me take this opportunity to congratulate you.
So thank you very much. And I think the important lesson, and unfortunately it appears that African governments didn't learn important lessons from the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic, is that in 2016, the African governments actually got together at the AU and they made these bold announcements that they were going to invest in vaccine manufacturing capacity on the African continent. And in 2020, when we faced the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, in that 4-year period, since that commitment had been made, there was absolutely no progress when it comes to setting up manufacturing facilities anywhere on the African continent, other than for very limited type of facilities that do exist in Senegal for yellow fever, in Egypt for some basic childhood vaccines, and in South Africa, which is not really a fully established manufacturing facility as yet, but rather mainly does full and finish. Those exceptions, there simply is no capacity to manufacture vaccine. But it goes beyond just being able to manufacture vaccine. It's also about Africa stepping up and taking a lead when it comes to the research and development part of vaccine development. So we can't expect that companies are going to provide through goodwill their IP rights to whatever vaccines they've developed. And it's essential that we actually are able to do the R&D, which lends itself eventually to total ownership of the entire process of vaccine manufacture, and also develops the type of security that's required to be able to produce vaccines specifically for African continent. So the initiative that we've embarked on with Dyadic, it's really leveraging on what is a new type of technology, but the technology that is much more efficient than other technologies to produce what we refer to as protein-based vaccines. So as an example, the Novavax vaccine, the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine is an example of protein-based vaccines. And many of the other vaccines that are used in childhood immunization programs, etc., are also protein-based vaccines rather than a more novel or the newer type of messenger RNA vaccines and non-replicating vector-based vaccines, which is AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson and Sputnik V vaccine. So it's a technology which is not only fit for purpose for COVID-19, but more important for me is that this is a technology that can be used to target other organisms, other diseases, using a protein-based approach.
Yes, certainly. And you mentioned the R&D capacity as being very critical to being able to sustain, I guess, the product pipeline of what African companies might be able to produce. But what can you tell us about the protein production platform that you have, in terms of just going into more details, how it compares with other technologies that are on offer, like the messenger RNA or the others? What makes it particularly suited for producing vaccines, not only for COVID, but for the other diseases that you mentioned that you'd like to target? What makes it particularly amenable for the resource-limited setting, like the African context?
So like the technology itself is novel, and it's sort of a high throughput technology of being able to produce proteins at the very economical, under very economical sort of circumstances. So a very low cost type of production compared to what it requires to produce messenger RNA vaccines or even the non-replicating vector-based vaccines. So the history of vaccines is that, like I said, the majority of vaccines that are used in children at the moment are actually protein-based rather than anything else. Some of the vaccines are the live attenuated, what we refer to as live attenuated vaccines, again, for which there's very limited capacity for vaccine manufacture in Africa, except for Senegal, which produces a limited number of yellow fever vaccines. It's an example of these live attenuated vaccines. But for the protein-based vaccines, Egypt does some protein-based vaccine manufacture, again, for some of the basic childhood vaccines. What we're looking at right now is being able to use this technology to develop vaccines against other organisms, including COVID. So COVID certainly is very much on our radar for the immediate future, but beyond that, we're also looking at developing vaccines against other organisms where we believe a protein-based approach would be suited. As an example, there's another very common virus known as respiratory syncytial virus, which is responsible for about 40% of all of the hospitalizations that take place in children under the age of 5 for pneumonia. So there are other companies, including Novavax, that have been looking at protein-based approaches to basically produce a vaccine against RSV. And similarly, there's also the possibility of being able to use the same technology to produce vaccines against influenza. Then in addition to that, what this type of approach also lends itself to is the development or manufacture of what we refer to as monoclonal antibodies. So monoclonal antibodies are, again, sort of protein molecules. And these monoclonal antibodies have been are currently being experimented on in relation to whether it can be used to prevent HIV, as an example. And certainly, again, for respiratory syncytial virus, there's real advances that's been made for the development of these monoclonal antibodies. We're giving it to a baby when the baby is born, protects the baby for the next 6 months, as an example, against developing RSV. So this type of an approach, the platform itself, the technology lends itself to development of protein-based vaccines against a number of different organisms, some of which we don't have vaccines for currently, including RSV, but also to basically start getting sort of a cheaper option when it comes to the manufacture of monoclonal antibodies, which to some extent is sort of a different type of vaccination strategy, what we call passive immunization, but certainly it's got huge potential for certain diseases.
So this technology would allow you to produce, other biologics, not only vaccines, a little bit more cost effectively compared to the methods that already exist.
Absolutely. We're looking at based on what Dyadic says, you probably would be able to, what currently costs around about $100 per dose, you probably would be able to bring that down to $1 a dose, which is massive. So the technology itself is highly efficient, but the challenge right now for us, obviously, is to ensure that we get the technology transfer done as soon as possible so we can start experimenting. And this is not the promise that we're going to be able to produce vaccines in a year from now. I think the entire notion that you can develop vaccines and start manufacturing it just over a 1 or 2 year period, unfortunately, is perhaps over-optimistic. This is a medium-term project. We would be highly successful if we are able to produce the first vaccines in 3 to 4 years from now, rather than 1 to 2 years from now.
Yes, well, we're certainly very desperate and we are hoping for anything, miracles to happen. But unfortunately, vaccine production is a timely process to develop. It doesn't happen overnight, but I mean, 3 to 4 years' time is obviously, I mean, in terms of looking forward to the future, we are still building the capacities that are needed across the continent. So it's still actually a very exciting project, I think, for the continent. So the technology transfer, you're still waiting for that to happen. When do you anticipate, at least, in terms of your planning, presumably you're going to do clinical trials to start testing that product to see how it performs in African populations. When do you anticipate that you might be, ready to get started with phase 1 clinical trials, phase 2 to take this product further into development?
Yeah, so the technology transfer is imminent. It will happen in the course of the next few weeks, not later than before the end of the year. So the technology transfer will have taken place. And then it's for our scientists to start using the technology and seeing how successful they are in replicating what Dyadic have been able to set up in the US and in Europe. So in terms of the actual products that would come out of this technology, in fact, in parallel to what we're doing with the technology transfer, we also have an agreement with Dyadic to do their first phase 1 trials of their COVID-19 vaccine in South Africa. And again, those are likely to start during the course of 2021. But this is now using the same technology, but the product itself is being manufactured outside of South Africa. But it will obviously already give us insight as to how well the COVID-19 vaccines that are produced by this technology would actually work in the local population. I think another important discussion, which unfortunately often we don't really delve into, which is critical in determining success, is the investment in human resources. And the reality is that in many of our higher education institutions, including in South Africa, there's very little type of training and exposure which would sort of equip scientists to be absorbed into these sort of manufacturing facilities and into this sort of industry. So the training program needs to be critically looked at. And it might well be that in the course of the first few years, that we largely are going to be dependent on the importation of skill, which is existent elsewhere, but not on the African continent. So the training is something that we shouldn't sort of ignore. And that requires for a robust partnership between the private sector as well as academia. Because academia on its own certainly can't do it, and the private sector are completely dependent on what comes out of the institutions for them to be successful. So the human sort of capacity development and investment in human resources is something that can't be underemphasized if we are seriously wanting to become countries where vaccine manufacture takes place, rather than where we only import vaccines.
Oh, definitely. I think, the skills development, the talent pipeline, incredibly important for the sustainability of those efforts that you're going to initiate with a project such as this in South Africa. So will you be looking to send people for training at other Dyadic facilities, or what kind of program do you have in mind in terms of developing that talent over the long term so that you can build up the kind of, range of skills that you would need for this project to be successful?
Yeah, so the Dyadic platform is a bit more simple in that they volunteer to send the scientists across to South Africa to actually assist us to set it up. And if need be, we can send our scientists across for them to get the exposure. But those are people that are sort of somewhat advanced in their careers and have got some sort of background when it comes to using this type of technology. But I think just beyond that also, it's about having that sort of pool of people moving forward that can sort of increase the critical mass that's required for us to succeed. But with Dyadic, as part of our agreement with the company, is that they would actually provide the type of training that's required and collaborations that are required to ensure that we are successful in setting this up in South Africa in the quickest time as possible.
Yes, and going back to the clinical trial, so Dyadic has agreements with they have licensed the same technology with other partners like Syngene International, which is a Biocon CRO, clinical research organization. Will you be looking to use some of the data that is obtained in the clinical trials in South Africa or elsewhere that you might conduct your trials in Africa, pulling them together with those that might be done, say, in India, in Latin America, where Dyadic has other partners in order to put everything together for marketing authorization of the vaccine?
Sure, certainly when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine, the nature of this COVID-19 vaccine trials is you're needing to do it in multiple countries so that your results can be generalizable. And it also provides the strength of being able to enroll sufficient number of individuals over a short period of time, which assists you in getting an answer as quickly as possible. But again, right now, as I mentioned, Dyadic are doing what we refer to as phase 1 trials, which is an initial phase of development where you just require less than 100 individuals. And it will probably only be sometime next year, should the phase 1, phase 2 trials show promising results, that they would go into the type of studies that truly require multiple countries to be involved, where you're needing to enroll 30 to 40,000 individuals. Obviously, when it comes to COVID-19 vaccine, it's a very sort of fast game. It's changing all the time, in that it might well be that in a few months from now, we don't have populations that have a huge number of people that are unvaccinated. And then that brings up a question as to, against what type of endpoint, what is going to be the purpose of evaluating future COVID-19 vaccines, and how are you going to do that? It might well be that you just need to look at the safety of the vaccine and then do some sort of what we call benchmarking against established immunological readouts to get an estimate as to whether the vaccines would perform similar to what has already been licensed. So it is a fast-moving space and difficult to say exactly what type of studies will be required come next year. But right now, the focus is just to make sure that we can get a phase 1 studies done as soon as possible, and that is being currently planned for South Africa, as well as possibly one of the European countries.
Yes, well, indeed, there is nothing at all predictable about this virus, about this pandemic, and the challenge of doing clinical trials, trying to follow the cycles and the different phases, the ebbs and flow of the variants is incredibly difficult. And in Africa in particular, we've had quite a challenge with clinical trials, right? They've been pretty limited. And you in particular, the clinical trials that you were able to do, you actually had to fight for them to go and argue with people why they should bring them to Africa and actually find the money to finance the clinical trials for the Novavax vaccine and the ChAdOx1 from the University of Oxford. What lessons, Prof. Madhi, do you think we should take from that experience of you having to actually negotiate why people should come and bring clinical trials in Africa? Should we have structures, formal structures that exist to do that job in a pandemic situation, to make sure that we have enough clinical trials happening on African soil?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the type of things which allowed for us to be successful in attracting the clinical trials to South Africa, firstly, is based on the type of networks that have already been established. And some of my networks, as an example, with the principal investigators of the University of Oxford study, goes back 25 years. We have known these people, so it was easy for me to reach out to them. But even when I reached out to them, they indicated, well, we can offer you the vaccine, but we don't have any funds to be able to actually fund the study. And these studies can be really, really expensive, which then put me into a different space where I needed to start looking at possible funders. And again, I think the networks that have been established over the past decade, if not more, really assisted in bringing that program together. But I think the important learning lessons is that we are naive to believe, and WHO tried to do this, and it didn't succeed bluntly, is that they set up this sort of initiatives, including the Solidarity Network, to try to do treatment trials, which it was partially successful with, and then to do vaccine trials. But the reality of the situation is that less than 5% of clinical trials are done on the African continent, even before COVID-19. And there's very little incentive on the part of industry to do studies on the African continent when they can actually undertake the same studies in high-income countries, where there's much less hurdles to be able to conclude the studies, and where the regulatory authorities actually insist that much of the clinical trial development needs to take place in high-income countries. So the FDA, the EMEA, MHRA, as an example, all of those regulatory authorities insist that the vast majority of participants in those trials should come from high-income countries rather than from an African country.
Right.
So there's a lot to be done in the space, but creating a network of clinical trials is something which is required, but all not sustainable in a way, because it depends on ongoing trials and ongoing evaluation of new vaccines to actually sustain it. And there's very few funders that will just set up facilities waiting for the next pandemic because there isn't any, well, I wouldn't say there isn't any reason to do it, but just economically, it's not a cost-effective way to do things. So it all boils down to our discussion right at the start, is that if Africa is wanting security when it comes to being involved at an early stage in the clinical development of vaccines, as well as the clinical evaluation of vaccines, we need to be having those facilities that are manufacturing vaccines on the continent. And then that puts us in a space where we can then make a claim to lead those vaccine programs right at the outset, rather than being an afterthought. And unfortunately, as we see across the continent, to date, there's only 5 vaccine trials that have been done on the African continent against COVID, 4 in South Africa, 1 that's taking place currently in Kenya. And that is really an indictment, not just on the part of African scientists not being able to get involved, but more so on the part of companies, where because there's little incentive for them to do the clinical trials on the African continent, they simply have sort of turned their backs on the continent in terms of understanding how these vaccines would work on the African continent, which is really essential if we are wanting to understand what impact the vaccines are going to have in the next few years.
Join us on the next episode as we continue our discussion with Professor Shabir Madhi and delve deeper into the work that the Rubic Consortium is doing on the production of vaccines on the African continent.